Alright, here's part 2 of my argument fields talk. So the field 4 is aesthetics, and of course aesthetics has to do with arts, or what people find pleasing artistically, or what they judge to be beautiful. Painting, sculpture, music, drama, whatever you can think of in that category. Even public speaking can be aesthetically pleasing. This is obviously using Toulmin's conception, a much looser area, because there's no rigid, well agreed upon standard about what makes art. That's why, for example, if you are interested in going to see a movie, you'll read the reviews, and sometimes you'll be astounded to discover that some critics are calling the film a masterpiece or the best film they've ever seen. And then other critics are dismissing it or saying that it's terrible. The same film, and you can say how people see things so differently, and you can broaden this disagreement to whole genres of artistic endeavors. Like, for example, some people like country music but hate jazz, and some people like classical music but hate hip hop. You know, it's so it's kind of interesting. It's certainly not as tight an argument field as, let's say, science or even jurisprudence, because there aren't as rigid standards for what's accepted. So I had you watch this video where Chris Rock and Rosario Dawson, who are the co-stars of the new movie Top 5, talk about the top 5 hip-hop artists, and they have assembled their group of quote-unquote experts on hip-hop, who give their reasons and actually make arguments why this or that person should be included. And I found that very entertaining. And that's, by the way, a theme and motif that runs through the movie itself, if you've heard about that movie or plan to see it. And it's interesting that argument is a very central aspect of that film in that dimension. So this is an area, you know, of argument that's clearly not as rigorous, as well defined, and we give people more of a pass on this. Okay, let's see. I am not moving to my next slide. Oh, got to go back. Field 5, politics. This one's pretty obvious, and the standard for judging an argument in the political spectrum is what we call expediency, meaning that we judge arguments based on something that we're trying to accomplish, and whether or not doing a certain thing or saying a certain thing will accomplish that end. And of course, oftentimes accomplishing that end in the short term means that we're abandoning a more important principle in the long term. We do a lot of expedient things for the economy, which from the scientific perspective might harm the environment. So those are two different argument fields, and so what works as an argument in the political field might not work in the scientific field, or vice versa. So one of the things that I'm interested in as a person who studies argument is how we jump the fields. In other words, that we're examining a question one place argumentatively, and then we jump somewhere else. So this video that you watched about the Dover trial, this was very interesting to me because the challenge there was on constitutional grounds. And whenever you examine the Constitution in a court of law, you're into an issue of justice. But in this case, the question is whether or not something in the science curriculum, or that was being mandated in the science curriculum, actually violates certain constitutional rights. So the only way to answer the question about the justice of teaching this or that in a courtroom or a classroom is to examine what science is. The judge can only render the justice decision by looking at the science question. So one of the reasons that the people who lost in that case were so frustrated is because they felt that the whole thing was reduced to the question of what is science, rather than examining what they wanted taught in the classroom. And that's interesting, and that shows that sometimes we're making an argument or even rendering a decision one case, we have to jump to another case. And I also would argue in the case of the Dover trial, the judge there had to jump back to the justice standard because he ultimately had to examine the constitutional question in light of the science that the participants in the trial examined in the courtroom. So very interesting. Another thing is expediency instead of justice, jumping from justice to politics, or making political decisions in lieu of decisions about justice. So this is O.J. Simpson at his trial, trying on the glove. So here's an interesting thing. The O.J. Simpson trial was an incredibly long trial. I think it went on for, 9 months or something like that? It was ridiculously long. And then when we finally get to the end of the trial, the jury goes out to deliberate. And you figure, here's a jury that's listened to testimony, much of it scientific and complex, for the better part of the year. They've been sequestered. They're really going to dig in, and they are going to examine every piece of evidence, and it might take as long for the jury to reach a decision as the trial itself. Well, the fact of the matter is I think it was within 4 hours the jury came back with their decision, which was not guilty. And one could argue that, listen, we just want to go home. That was the way they reached their decision. So since there was any disagreement on the jury, the only way to resolve the disagreement would be to vote not guilty. What other explanation could there be? Did they really think that after watching all that evidence and all that testimony that they could just be dismissive on the basis of the evidence? No, they were probably thinking in terms of, enough already, we've seen enough of this, it's over, we're going home. Another, moving from justice to aesthetics. This might sound a little bit strange, but here's a situation where this woman, I don't remember her name, she was the Attorney General from the state of California, and President Obama was at a fundraiser and introduced her as the most attractive district attorney in the United States. He got, by the way, a lot of criticism for saying that. But it goes to something that I experienced myself as a graduate student when I studied argumentation in the courtroom, and I would go in and I would watch trials, and the trials would be really, really complex and elaborate, and a lot of evidence was given and a lot of testimony was given. At the end of the trial, you would not be able to get at or understand the reasons that the jury made a particular decision, especially since the trial seemed to look really going in one direction and the jury's decision seemed to go in really another direction. And sometimes, by interviewing the jurors after the trials, which I did, I was able to learn that they really had aesthetic responses to the questions in the trial. And by that I mean they were physically responding to how people looked and how attractive they were. So for example, if they would see a prosecutor that was very handsome and very well dressed, they might mistrust him as a very successful and maybe manipulative lawyer. In other situations, the witnesses themselves, it was less important what they were saying as whether they were sympathetic, and oftentimes the sympathy went to how they looked or how they dressed. So somebody was very beautiful and therefore was credible, or somebody was very menacing looking and therefore was not credible, or dress or manner of speaking or educational capability. It's amazing how people respond in an almost psychologically aesthetic way to things in the courtroom, and the beauty of an argument might outweigh the factual nature of an argument as a lawyer sums up his or her case. Science to politics. Okay, so the most famous case in our time is global warming. Currently 90+% of scientists who work in the area of climate are claiming that human beings are directly affecting the climate on the planet by adding extra carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And whether or not that's true or whether or not you agree with it, that's a scientific claim. Some politicians have said, well, we have to do something about that. They shift to the issue of expediency and saying that this evidence is overwhelming and it represents a crisis. But some politicians will say, we have problems that we have to address right now that are immediate, and so they'll just say right out, so as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't even matter. Whether or not that's happening doesn't bother me. I don't accept it. And if I can find anything within the minority position that I can cling to, I will argue it only for political purposes to say it's not expedient, or we do not have to act expediently in response to global warming. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not weighing in on the issue here. I'm just saying that some people would say the only way that we can continue to address anything in our world is to continue to be strong economically and politically, and those questions have priority over questions of science. Ironically, it is the scientific questions and the political questions that seem to dominate most of our world, and oftentimes they're in profound conflict with each other. So we accept scientific standards for almost everything in our world. That's pretty much the master field of argument. And we let political decisions govern almost everything that's happening economically and otherwise. And so often those things don't coincide, and it seems as though we're never acting in our own long-term best interest because we're doing political things that undermine scientific facts, and we're discovering science which is operating pretty much at the mercy of politics. And by the way, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's the physicist who was the host of Cosmos, said that we wouldn't have had a space program if the politicians didn't see that there was some military or political advantage of getting to space before the Russians. He said it was purely an expediency, and he said, and now we're not exploring space because we don't perceive that the Russians are a threat to us, and so we don't have to do that. And so that's a pretty interesting example of how he sees an argument field shift having taken place, and thereby undermining something that a lot of people think is important. Okay, so this must be my last slide because the slides aren't advancing anymore. Let me just double check that. Yeah, and that takes me back to the beginning. So that was argument field theory. I'll wrap it up there, and I'll be uploading an exam very shortly. Take care. Post any questions you have on the discussion board. Weiss out.